Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, in spite of the fact that I touch on bioethics, and I don't think I'm supposed to touch on bioethics, but as you'll see, I left out the bioethics in the title. And hopefully you'll see how relevant what I have to say is to the general area that we are discussing. Reproductive issues are rarely seen as being central to the science-faith divide. And they're not generally viewed as being central to the relationship between science and religion. And I think debates within the science and the realm of science and religion normally exclude bioethics and exclude biomedical issues, because these are seen as being exclusively the domain of medical ethics or bioethics. But the more I study these questions, the more I've come to realize that they bring us face to face with quite profound theological questions. As profound, I think, as anything encountered in more general biological realms, or possibly even in the physical sciences, although, of course, the issues are totally different. And the reason I say this is that the reproductive technologies confront us in very practical terms with the relationship between human and divine control, between that which should or should not be subject to the interference of human beings, and which should or shouldn't be left to the whims of fate or chance or the dictates of God. In other words, where does God enter the picture? Now, it's difficult to overestimate the seismic effects that in vitro fertilization, or IVF, has had on the societies in which we live. Its use in bypassing infertility has been overshadowed by the many other uses to which it can be put in transforming the reproductive process and in contributing to medical progress. These and other consequences of IVF depend upon one overriding ability, and that, of course, is the ability to investigate and to manipulate human embryos in the laboratory. And as a result of this, the human embryo has ceased to be a mysterious and an unfathomable entity. And this, of course, is the root of the disquiet expressed by many when confronted by techniques for controlling embryonic development. Control of our earliest beginnings is equated with control of our lives as human beings. And all our fears stemming from this second form of control, which is of our lives as human beings, they are expressed in the form of opposition to the first type of control, which is control of our earliest beginnings. And so it is that PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is an offshoot of IVF, this enshrines the fears of many over the power of human beings to intrude into what some take to be territory peculiarly set apart for God's actions. And that, of course, then is why I made my comments earlier about the relationship between divine and human control. The tension in this instance revolves around the widespread theological notion that the manner in which our lives commence and the way in which they come to an end lies entirely in God's hands. In other words, there are realms that lie outside the influence or even the interest of human beings. God brings each of us as individuals into existence, and God brings our lives as individuals to an end. That is sometimes seen as being the beginning and the end of theological discussion. But of course, if that is even remotely true, what becomes of efforts to overcome infertility or to prolong someone's life by technological means? It seems that the former, which is what happens at the beginnings of life, appear to pose greater theological challenges for some Christians than the latter, what happens at the end of life. Now, if you want convincing that this is the case, sit on any government committee that elicits public opinion on procedures such as IVF, PGD, the production of surplus embryos in IVF programs, research on human embryos, the derivation of embryonic stem cells from embryos, production of interspecies embryos, and even contraception. Many of the submissions will be opposed to some or all of these procedures, with a sizable number opining that scientists and clinicians are playing God, and that they're entering divine territory, which is forbidden to all except God. And whatever the motives of some of the submitters, the religious connotations are only too clear. Alongside this are concerns that any interference with human embryos will result in designer babies, once again implying that the modification or selection of embryos is taking us into highly suspect and even forbidden territory. And so repeatedly, the message that comes across is that under no circumstances should human beings be permitted to meddle in the biological characteristics of future individuals, since design, in this sense, is a step too far for created beings. Now, all the procedures that I am alluding to are now integral to the reproductive technologies. And so objections of this ilk pit these particular religious perspectives against scientific medicine. Now, underlying these religious perspectives is the view that human embryos have a moral equivalent to that of adults. The basis for this position is, of course, the position that human life commences at fertilization. Now, for some, this leads to the categorical assertion that to allow any destruction of human embryos under any circumstances is contrary to God's ordinances. And for many within the Christian community, this is regarded as a faithful outworking of their Christian worldview. Now, my point in alluding to this issue isn't to argue for the rightness or wrongness of that particular position, which I'm certainly not going to do today, but it is to suggest that the religious convictions of some are diametrically opposed to a whole area of scientific investigation and to the clinical practice that emanates from this. And so the result is that a whole range of approaches within the reproductive technologies becomes alien territory to those with this particular religious stance. Now, of course, one may or may not think that this is of significance in the grand scheme of science-religion debates. But I think it does have two extremely important repercussions. The first is that those with this religious persuasion have little way of influencing public policy on the reproductive technologies, unless they can persuade policymakers that the whole reproductive endeavor on which we've embarked is massively misguided. And this, of course, is the position espoused by the Vatican, as reiterated in the recent document Dignitas Personae. Now, one may have no qualms about this, yet it appears that the possibility of constructive dialogue has been lost, and that the possibility of counterbalancing some of the more extreme secular trends within society has been forfeited. The second repercussion is that it allows little opportunity for ongoing debate, even within Christian circles, because Christians differ on the ethical and the theological significance of fertilization. This debate becomes superfluous if no reproductive technologies are allowable on allegedly theological grounds. Now, while of course there may be considerable inconsistency in the outworking of this stance, even its theoretical formulation amounts to a stifling of any science-religion debate in this area. And it seems to me that this has negative consequences for theological input into scientific policy and ethical decision-making. So the issue in this instance then is that one particular position, that for some has theological warrant, it's implacably opposed to the dominant scientific position. Now, as I've said before, this doesn't presuppose which one is correct, but it certainly demonstrates that there is incongruence between the two. And so I have no hesitation then in dealing with the subject of manufacturing humans within the science-religion context. Because what we have here is a particularly modern expression of the unease with which the intersection between science and religion may sometimes be viewed. And of course, one fascinating characteristic of this issue is its intensely practical facade. There's no way in which it can be quietly parked in the halls of academia. After all, those who encounter this daily are ordinary people confronted by one or other of the many facets of infertility. Rarely are they well informed about the abstruse theological arguments or the scientific developments that often surround the embryo, any more, of course, than are ordinary pastors, Christian ministers, or even, and I hesitate to say this, most theologians. The modernity of these questions is as striking, I think, as are their emotive responses. Let's look at what I call a shifting universe. Over 20 years ago, it was in 1987, I wrote a book entitled Manufacturing Humans, The Challenge of the New Reproductive Technologies. And in the preface to that book, I commented that the rapid developments in the reproductive technologies were proving as frenetic in ethical and theological circles as in laboratories and clinics. Little did I know at that time that such a sentiment would be even more apposite in the early years of the 21st century. Because, of course, the debates have intensified as scientific developments in biology and medicine continue to far outstrip our ethical, let alone our theological systems to cope with them. As we know, modern medicine ushers in immense hope. But of course, never far removed from the hopes and the anticipations are perils of many descriptions. It seems to me that our view of ourselves as human beings has been fundamentally changed by numerous improvements in the quality of our lives, from the earliest stages of development through to old age. But if we as humans can so profoundly affect the sort of lives we live, what room is left for God? Has any vestige of equilibrium between science and faith been destroyed? Now, you might think that that sounds unduly dramatic. Let's consider one or two facts, one or two developments. By 1989, more than 400,000 children had been born using IVF. By today, that figure is way over 3 million. In some countries, a significant percentage of all children born are born by IVF. In 1987, IVF was a relatively simple procedure, and few of its associated developments were even on the horizon. And in particular, the technique of intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI, something that has revolutionized the efficacy of IVF and is very generally used today, that of course lay in the future. The procedure of PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, was unheard of in 1987. With its advent in 1989, the world of genetic diagnosis was turned upside down through our newfound ability to select embryos. And in the intervening years, PGD has become a subject of vociferous theological debate. Writing in 1987, there was no way in which I would or could have mentioned embryonic stem cells, simply because the general public had never heard of them. And no one would have considered that their utilization might have theological overtones. All that changed in 1998, when they were first successfully derived from human embryos. And in some quarters, the ethical issues that they raise eclipse even those raised by abortion. In 1987, cloning elicited little public or theological interest, and the work of developmental biologists was happily ignored. All this, as you know, changed with the 1997 announcement of the birth of Dolly. And of course, with poor old Dolly came an avalanche of dire warnings predicting the end of humanity as we know it. Not surprisingly, in 1987, practically no one knew anything about therapeutic or research cloning, let alone iPS cells, induced pluripotent cells, stem cells, which are far closer to the present day. But today, these are recognized as a major way forward for regenerative medicine, although for some, all this is a threat to human dignity. And then in 1987, chimeras and hybrids were nothing more than threatening, part human, part animal, grotesque monsters that you encountered in Greek mythology and perhaps science fiction. We couldn't have imagined that by 2009, they would have entered the domain of serious science. Or, a slightly different area, but I'll come back and I will touch on this just briefly towards the end. In the 1980s, around 8% of babies born prematurely at 23 weeks survived. Obviously, these are in certain selected areas. I'm giving here some UK figures. But in the UK today, about 50% of these may survive with aggressive treatment. In the 1980s, around 40 to 45% of babies born before 28 weeks survived. The comparable figure today is at least 80%. So that gives you some idea of the sort of changes that have occurred in just 20 years or so. What then, let's go back to the 1980s, what about the responses to IVF in the mid-1980s? I'm going to refer to the UK situation because it was so nicely worked out there, and of course so much of, I think, of the very vigorous and I think very helpful debate has actually occurred in the UK. Now in the UK, the 1984 report of the Warner Committee proved nothing less than cataclysmic. The inquiry agreed that human embryos have a special status and should be afforded some protection in law. But this status isn't equal to that of actual persons, and so this protection may be waived and research on human embryos allowed under license up to 14 days after fertilization. The inquiry concluded that infertility is a condition meriting treatment and that IVF could now be considered an established form of treatment. That, remember, was in the mid-1980s. The inquiry also concluded that egg and embryo donation was acceptable with certain provisos. Now, those and certain other conclusions, which I don't want to go into, they prompted an outpouring of theological responses. And I think it's important to reflect on these from 20 years hence. And some of the most damning condemnations of IVF and its associated procedures came from theologians. I'll give you just two examples. According to one theologian, when we start making human beings by the use of artificial means like IVF, we stop loving them. In other words, when human beings intrude in the reproductive process, they take the whole process out of the hands of God. Under these circumstances, it was claimed, the IVF child becomes the creature of the doctors who were in part responsible for bringing him or her into existence. Another theologian concluded that modern reproductive technology represents a threat to the future of the human race. The culprit was seen as medical science, with its ability to cross both species boundaries and family boundaries. And in doing this, it was claimed that it is directly challenging fundamental God-ordained boundaries. According to this theologian, what follows from this is that there is no room for any aspect of IVF, including any experimentation on embryos, surrogate motherhood, or indeed any form of technological manipulation. Now, I've just referred very, very briefly to two individual theologians, but they, of course, were far from isolated voices in the 1980s within the Christian community. A large variety of church bodies, from conservative Protestant to Roman Catholic, took an uncompromisingly negative view of the practice of IVF. Basic to all these positions was the stance that since the embryo is inviolable from the time of fertilization, no embryo should ever be destroyed. Since this had already happened in the development of IVF, and of course it was ongoing as a consequence of the production of surplus embryos in IVF programs, the conclusion was that there could be no room for IVF within a Christian ethical framework. IVF was also regarded by some as an act of mastery, in which human individuals are treated as little more than the subjects of technological manipulation and domination, leading, it was claimed, to the view that the artificial production of children is, by its very nature, dehumanizing. The Pontifical Academy for Life, meeting in 2004, 26 years, of course, after the birth of the first IVF baby, it reinforced the official Roman Catholic position on the artificial reproductive technologies, or the ARTs. It argued that these constitute an unworthy method for the coming forth of a new life, whose beginning depends in large measure on the technical action of third parties outside the couple, and takes place in a context totally separated from conjugal love." End of quote. For the Academy, a child obtained through the use of ART is on the same level as a product, a value of which is determined simply by its biological quality. And so consequently, it's not surprising that embryos lacking the requisite quality are, it argued, systematically eliminated. The argument then was that surplus embryos in IVF programs are viewed as suffering an absurd fate, on the ground that those who ordered them are now rejecting them. And of course, it's this latter viewpoint that has been enforced by the recently promulgated Vatican pronouncement, Dignitas Personae. And the one thing, it really disagreed with all the developments, but it was unable to reach a conclusion on what should be done with surplus embryos. Now, of course, while the opposition to IVF and the ARTs in general represents just a Christian response, it is only one response, and it's not the only one by any means. And so if you go back to the 1980s, a minority of church bodies at that time supported all the recommendations of the Warnock Report, although they tended to draw a line at embryo donation and the production of embryos for research purposes. While affirming the central significance of human life in the image of God and the importance of respecting it, they were willing to accept that during its first 14 days of development, the human embryo is not entitled to the same respect and the same protection as an embryo implanted in the uterus. And so, these bodies, of which there were quite a few of them, they were in a position to approve the use of surplus embryos in IVF programs for use in research purposes. Well, that was the 1980s. What then about now, or at least closer to the present? 20 years further on, we have to ask what has changed. As I've already indicated, there have been quite dramatic developments in the science. To what extent, if any, have Christian perspectives been influenced by the scientific developments? In other words, is the contemporary theological debate markedly different from that of the mid to the late 80s? Would we expect it to be? And even more importantly, I think, and I'm not going to try and answer this question, do we expect it to change over the coming 20 years? Or is it oblivious to everything that is occurring scientifically and clinically? Well, my conclusion is that little has changed. Today's theological scene is remarkably similar to the theological scene of the 1980s. It's almost as if the developments of these past 20 years hadn't taken place. Those prepared to accommodate to the challenges presented by IVF are prepared to accommodate to the challenges of PGD, embryonic stem cells, and therapeutic cloning. On the other hand, those who saw IVF as entering illicit divine territory are appalled at subsequent developments. And, from their angle, these only serve to demonstrate that their initial repugnance was well and truly justified. In other words, what they would argue is that biomedical interventions into reproduction are to be opposed and resisted as a theological imperative. But I think something quite fascinating is happening. As we move closer to the present time, we've got this phenomenon. That is, that the traditional division of opinion over the role of artificial intrusions into the reproductive domain between some Protestant groups and Roman Catholics is less clear than was once the case. This is especially true in some more conservative evangelical circles. In order to demonstrate this, I want to take two surprising examples. At least they're surprising to me. They turn, I think, upside down our preconceived notions of how different groups respond. The first example I want to give you is an intensely conservative interpretation that comes from Edwin Hui, Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Christianity and Chinese Culture at Regent's College in Canada. He works out his position very thoroughly indeed in his 2002 book, At the Beginning of Life, Dilemmas in Theological Ethics. What is striking is that the writer is located at an evangelical theological college, and the book was published by a leading American evangelical publisher. Now, Hui's basic theological postulate is that the human soul is present at conception, and that potentialities and capacities are given from the moment of God's creative act. And so, one is a person from fertilization onwards, and personhood is conveyed irrespective of one's inability to respond to God on account of one's iniquity, developmental immaturity, or disability. And I quote him, "To the extent that modernity has allowed science to replace God, and modern people are left all the more disoriented, modern anthropology has allowed scientific technological reproduction to replace divine-initiated human procreation. Modern persons are left all the more depersonalized." Now, a major outworking of this framework is Hui's opposition to any technological inroads into the reproductive process, including artificial contraceptives, the whole gamut of the artificial reproductive technologies, embryo manipulation, and surrogacy. And in his view, use of the artificial reproductive technologies forces God to accept the child when he has not given that gift of life. And that, of course, is a direct quote. He vigorously opposes use of embryonic stem cells, since from his perspective, this reflects a total disregard for the value of embryonic lives. And so his theological stance renders unacceptable any study of human embryos. Now, it seems to me that in this position, what we have is a very clear expression of conflict between science and Christian perspectives. And I don't think that Christians writing today can avoid having to face head-on the plethora of procedures in the artificial reproductive arena. And I would say that in this arena, science and theology are staring one another in the face. The nature and the relevance of one's theological position to cope with the research questions and possible therapeutic applications of embryo-based scientific aspirations, these, I think, are issues that we cannot avoid, whatever answers we have to them. That's Hui's position. It seems to me that we have a startling counterpoint to Hui by the writings of two well-known Roman Catholic bioethicists, Thomas Shannon and James Walter. And this is expressed very clearly in their 2003 book, The New Genetic Medicine. And I think the writings of these two authors are exemplary for their willingness to wrestle with new scientific findings and directions, and with the possible implications of these for traditional formulae, including the magisterial teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. The authors contend that an individual is not present until about 2 to 3 weeks after the beginning of fertilization. They write, and this is just one quote from them, "While the pre-implantation embryo contains the appropriate genetic information for the organism's development, that genetic information is not necessarily associated with a specific individual and cannot therefore claim moral privilege through such an association. The genetic uniqueness is associated with what is common to all human nature, not a particular individual, because such an entity does not yet exist." End of quote. Now, in view of those arguments, they are resolute in stating that the early embryo cannot claim absolute protection because it is not an individual person from fertilization. More specifically, and again I quote, "There is a time period of about 3 weeks during which it is biologically unrealistic to speak of a physical individual. This means that the reality of a person is not present at least until individualization has occurred. Individuality is an absolute or necessary condition for personhood." End of quote. On the other hand, they are equally clear in asserting that the early embryo is valuable. And this is based on the fact that it is living, it has the human genetic code, and it possesses genetic uniqueness. Its value does not depend, according to them, on the presence of characteristics like intelligence or a capacity for relationships. And taken together, these arguments lead them to claim that the pre-implantation embryo has what they describe as a pre-moral value. And their argument is that this pre-moral value must be judged in the light of other pre-moral and moral goods, such as the benefits that may accrue from research on these embryos in reproductive and other areas. And so consequently, it's the pre-implantation embryo's lack of individuality that is a key element in justifying the lack of its absolute protection and also the possibility of conducting research on it. And so in the light of these concepts, these authors, these two Roman Catholic authors, are prepared to allow research on human embryos, including embryonic stem cell research and therapy and therapeutic cloning. They are very careful in specifying limits and constraints in all cases, especially, of course, in terms of their underlying theological vistas, and their attempt to attain coherence between moral theology and modern embryology. Now, it seems to me that Shannon and Walter's contribution is characterized by a determined effort to reinterpret traditional theological viewpoints in the light of contemporary scientific understanding. And from their angle, and they argue this at some length, this is not a departure from the tradition itself, because in their view, the tradition was based in part on what would now be considered to be outdated scientific concepts. And so their approach doesn't represent a weakening of the religious tradition within which they work, but from their angle, it is a reaffirmation of it in contemporary terms. Now, I have no doubt that the result in practice comes as a shock to many people, both within the Roman Catholic tradition and outside it. And of course, it stands in stark contrast to Hui's conclusions. And I think that the differences between these writers raise quite crucial questions. Is it possible for a theological position to be completely independent of scientific input? Now, of course, we've had that sort of thing touched on in totally different contexts this morning, but I think it comes back here. Is it possible for a theological position to be completely independent of scientific input? If the answer is no, what is the role of science in arriving at a theologically acceptable position? Further, do different theological positions reflect differences in scientific understanding and interpretation, as much as they reflect differences in theological worldviews? And I think these comments open up another consideration, and this is whether it is legitimate to change one's stance theologically. I think with that in mind, Shannon and Walter throw down the gauntlet, because their challenge is that our theological viewpoints may be dependent, in part at least, upon scientific concepts. And if that's correct, changes in certain aspects of a theological perspective would be expected to occur following major changes in some scientific notions. Let me give you one example where that's happened. The Church of Scotland, with its 2006 report, Embryo Research, Human Stem Cells and Cloned Embryos, does, I think, provide us with that. In this particular report, the 2006 one, they acknowledge the lack of consensus within the Church and within the working group on when human life begins. But the report gives some support to some embryo research. This was because a majority of the working group held to a more gradual view of the moral status of the embryo. On the other hand, they recognized very clear limits, and they led the group to oppose the deliberate creation of human embryos for research or to serve as the source of cells for routine therapeutic purposes. But even here, exceptions may be recognized according to this report, as, for instance, when serious disease could be alleviated. What's interesting to me is that this contrasts with its earlier 1996 report, 10 years previously, and that took a far more conservative view of the embryo, and therefore it opposed all embryo research. Now, of course, one has to speculate on why this change has come about over a 10-year period by the same church body, and also whether some of the current restrictions that they thought should apply, whether they would still be in place a further 10 years on. And so that raises the question, how important is the passage of time with its opportunity to reflect further on the science and also on the theological implications stemming from this? This gets me then to another question. How compelling is Christian input into ethical debate? I think it's tempting to assume that Christians of similar theological persuasion will adopt similar stances on ethical issues. This isn't always the case, and I want to show that by reference to two articles on embryonic stem cells, both by authors purporting to espouse a reformed Christian worldview. Now, I could have chosen other examples from other theological perspectives, but I think these illustrate the point very clearly. One of the authors, Robert Boomsma, looks to the themes of creation, fall, redemption, stewardship, human worth, the kingdom of God, and social justice as central to a reformed perspective. And for him, the fundamental principle is provided by God's sovereignty over all his creation in the natural and moral realms. The creation, fall, redemption imperative leads Boomsma to argue that since disease wasn't part of God's original plan, its alleviation is a high calling for Christians who are to work as Christ's agents in helping to redeem the brokenness of the world. And along these lines, the use of human embryonic stem cells to cure previously intractable diseases would provide a significant step toward redeeming the brokenness of creation. I mean, that's his position. And these stances are made possible by his adoption of a gradualist position on embryonic status, although he is at pains to stress that the embryo is to be treated with appropriate respect. This also enables him to justify the use of surplus embryos from IVF programs in embryonic stem cell research if the aim is the curing of disease. But he doesn't go as far as to allow the creation of embryos for research purposes. Now, what's interesting is that in response to that article, there was another perspective, quite a different one put forward by Adrian Tiao and Donald Calbreth, who also write from the perspective of a reformed Christian worldview. Their starting point, though, is the protection of humans from fertilization onwards. And so they oppose embryonic stem cell research on the grounds that the destruction of human embryos is nothing less than a direct attack on human worth. They argue that God sees every human being as valuable, as designed for his purposes and as bearing his image. And so, from their perspective, the unjust destruction of human life, as in the destruction of embryos, is an attack on his image, on his purpose. They relegate the notion of Christians as stewards of God's creation to a position of secondary importance if it's likely to indicated by their rejection of the use of surplus embryos from IVF programs, which they view as a violation of human dignity and as inherently disrespectful. The use of surplus embryos is an illustration of doing evil in order to bring about good, and it should be rejected. Now, possibly represent the Reformed Christian position on the human embryo and embryonic stem cells. But more importantly, can either do so. To reflect on these questions, I think a number of considerations appear. As we look at them, first of all, the respective authors have emphasized different facets of what they perceive to be the Reformed tradition. These emphases have then colored the conclusions that they have subsequently reached. And in both cases, inevitably, choices have been made. And implicit within those choices are preferences. Secondly, I'd venture to suggest that there is ethical and theological murkiness in this area. There's a great deal we do not know, and a vast amount about which we cannot be certain as Christians. Christian knowledge and understanding in this area, it seems to me, are limited. And so humility is called for on matters where there is limited, explicit theological guidance. None of us has complete insight or understanding. And I think we are to look to the complementary insights of others, both within and outside the body of Christ. From this I conclude that there is no exclusive, unerring Christian bioethical position on contemporary issues that traverse scientific, moral, theological, and social boundaries. Christians should be characterized by attitudes that seek to bring sustenance and hope to as many as possible, and by a commitment to the flourishing of personal life. But I don't think that this will lead to homogeneity in thought forms. It may well be demonstrated in and through differing theological emphases. So I consider the Christian contributions to bioethical debate, such as the one I've touched on, I think they're restricted, but nevertheless I think they are significant. The Christian voice should be heard, with a stress on human dignity and flourishing at all stages of human existence and in all countries and societies. If this voice is lacking, utilitarian and functionalist considerations may well come to reign supreme. But I don't think we should underestimate the hard work and the challenging thinking required of all within Christian communities. Looking back to well-trodden church and denominational pronouncements may prove less helpful than frequently thought, especially where these represent conventional thinking uninformed by nuanced scientific input. And so, let's look at the Borderlands. In my view, we cannot go back. But if we could, what would we go back to? The intrusion of technology into the earliest stages of human existence is but one manifestation of the intrusion of technology into every facet of our existence. How many of us have ever taken a pill to subdue pain, or bring anxiety, blood pressure, or heartbeat under control? Did we have any theological quibbles about acting in this manner? When compared with 100 or more years ago, the quality of our lives, physical and mental, is insuperably improved within the sort of societies in which we live. One might even say the quality of our lives is enhanced by the general level of medical and allied care in countries such as we live in. We should also remember, though, that when we speak of the reproductive technologies, we shouldn't confine ourselves to the early embryo. What about technological intervention at birth, particularly premature birth? The ethical and technical issues here may be horrendously demanding, especially when confronted by babies born at 23 or 24 weeks gestation. Practically all of these babies are born at the borderline of viability, and they'll only be rescued by high technology intensive neonatal care. But even under the best of circumstances, issues of long-term morbidity may be just as important as the prospect of survival. This is an intensely artificial world that has elicited little theological opposition, probably because efforts are directing at rescuing life rather than destroying it. And yet it seems to me that it raises profound questions about the relationship between human and divine control. Now, of course, some of the effects of applying the reproductive technologies at the beginning of life may be far from ambivalent. Some of them may be evil and dehumanizing. Some exponents of the technologies may give the appearance of being more interested in manipulating human nature than bringing wholeness to suffering humanity. And then, of course, there are very deeply troubling commercial pressures that may sometimes be alarmingly exploitative. And we've had one fascinating and tragic example of that in the United States in recent weeks. The task of ethics, including theologically informed ethics, is to distinguish between the various forces at work. But how do we do this? Just look at this quotation. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the reproductive technologies. Following Christ means living like Jesus. Jesus modeled servanthood, self-sacrifice, and special concern for the poor and neglected. All that sounds foreign to our modern years because we are not accustomed to denying ourselves in order to serve others. Instant gratification is at the core of modern life. Costly self-denial is at the center of Jesus' way. And that, it seems to me, is the problem facing all of us who attempt to bring our theological perspectives to bear on the ever-burgeoning reproductive technologies, because their development is scientifically driven, but their application is community-driven. The former is largely dependent upon the ethos of science, whereas the latter depends upon the worldview and hence the interpretive framework of the community. Instant gratification, serving one's own interests and enhancing one's physical well-being are, as we know, dominant forces, and I think they stand in stark contrast to central Christian imperatives. And in my view, it's at this point that theology should be making its presence felt, rather than in endlessly reworking arguments as to when embryos acquire absolute moral value, because that's the sort of value we fail to give to innumerable embryos, let alone most human beings once they've been born. This is because we are either totally unable to protect most embryos with chromosomal and genetic abnormalities, or we lack the moral and political will to protect suffering humanity in countries with hideously high neonatal and childhood mortality rates due largely to preventable diseases. The position I've reached is that a Christian commitment should be directed at arguing for ways in which the technology should be applied, rather than in whether the technology should or should not exist. And I think this brings us to the heart of the science-religion debate in this very highly charged area. And so, to finish, if my position is accepted, the major task confronting Christians is to delineate the pastoral dimensions of the reproductive technologies. The science behind the artificial reproductive technologies will become more rather than less invasive. It will lead to increasingly delicate interrelationships between what we perceive to be divine and human control. I think mapping the contours of these interrelationships is a task urgently awaiting those who accept the dictum that science informs faith and faith informs science. Thank you very much.
There's actually a lot I could say in response to that, but I won't focus on one. It seemed... Okay, it seemed that a key issue in the whole debate, of course, is the status of embryos. And you're talking about how church groups change their position over time in response to science. Well, it seems to me there's, in the examples you gave, there's two ways they could have changed their response. One way is that they found new information about twinning and totopotency, and so that's led them to revise their stance on the embryo. So certain facts about the embryo, we can change it. The other one is that, well, most scientists are doing it anyway, so we should change our position. And it seems to me really important which of those two approaches we take, because I'm sympathetic to the first view that if we have new facts about the embryo, we should change our status. But the idea that we should change our status on the position just because everyone else is doing it seems to be not a very good moral argument at all. So I'm wondering if you clarify that ambiguity.
It's very hard for me to tell you what were the motivations, of course, of the various people and the various groups who have changed their position. I mean, on the one hand, I have huge sympathy with those who are totally consistent and have been consistent for however many years. The problem, of course, in practice is that we are often, even if we are consistent on the theory, we are not consistent in the practice. I mean, I just wonder how many IVF children there are in most of our churches. Probably quite a few. How do we treat them then? I mean, do we actually go along the path of saying, well, they're not really proper people, are they? They really are the creatures? Well, of course not. But how do we treat them? I mean, do we see them as being somehow subhuman? I'm sure we don't. But more importantly, how do we actually relate to their parents, who of course are the ones who have brought them into existence? I mean, are we actually going to say, well, we think that you have done something which is rather substandard from a theological and Christian angle, or that, so once you get to the pastoral side of it, I think you've then got this real dilemma of to say, well, if this is being done, if it is so common, we're not seeing anything too draconian in at least societies where all this is controlled, as opposed to some society where it's not controlled. And we perhaps now realize that the huge concerns that we had initially are no longer justified, because we're now seeing, in a sense, the end results. So, in a sense, I'm not quite sure that I can strictly answer your question. I've got sympathy with your question. I certainly do not think we should just accept anything because the scientists can do it.
Practices in the church like divorce or promiscuity, for example, which, if we're honest, are widespread in the church.
That's right.
It doesn't mean we just say, oh, well, obviously this is what everyone's doing, so we just change our teaching. I mean, presumably that's not a sensible way to...
No. But I just wonder if you pick up on something like divorce, whether or not we have actually changed our viewpoint. I mean, I'm talking in very global terms now. I mean, perhaps, well, I'm not justifying that at all. But I think, I mean, a lot of people, including theologians, including Christians, all of us, we do often have concerns about the unknown. Something is going to happen. And after all, when you look at one or two of the very good people, theologians with whom I have considerable, and I looked up to, the one or two who were talking about IVF before it happened, and there were literally one or two, most weren't interested. Their argument against IVF was that you didn't know what the first child would be like. Now, okay, now that might have been seen as being a legitimate position beforehand. But then when you see what the first child was like, pretty ordinary and straightforward, and nothing out of the ordinary, then perhaps one has to look back and to say, well, was that particular concern justified? So I would hope that all along, as we see the possibilities of things and things that are happening, then I think we have to then look and ask ourselves, well, were our concerns legitimate? Or were they somewhat overblown? Or on the other hand, do we still have those concerns? But if they do have the concerns, then there are huge implications in practice, and I think we have to be consistent at that point.
Okay. Any other question?
Can I just ask a biological question? I was just interested to know what the biological reasons were why Shannon and Walter decided that for 3 weeks you couldn't do a person with an embryo because it wasn't usable. What is the biological difference before 3 weeks to after 3 weeks?
Most people put it at 2 weeks, 14 or 15 days, which is the primitive streak. And in essence, I mean, there are a lot of subcomponents to this argument. But in essence, there is a relative lack of organization before 14 days, and it is then the organization, top, bottom, left, right, becomes far more evident straight after 14 days. I mean, and there are other aspects to it about implantation at 14 days, no possibility of twinning, etc., etc., of which, I'm not entirely besotted by all those arguments. I think you can argue both ways on them. I mean, the other thing is, and again, I don't think that they actually, personally, I don't think they're very convincing on their 3 weeks. It's all a little bit vague with them. But of course, one could argue that the very first indication of a nervous system is round about 3 weeks. A lot of people in the literature, well, certainly in the ethical literature, quite erroneously say it's really at 14 days, but it's later. So the very first indications of a nervous system are around about 3 weeks. I mean, I think what they're saying is that prior to 2 or 3 weeks, and they leave it a bit vague, and I think they are sensible to do that. I think what they're saying is that you do have you have human tissues. Human tissues are always of value. That's why they use this term pre-moral value. So they see it as being that, whereas afterwards you can then begin to identify a new individual in a sense in which it's much more difficult beforehand. Although my own view is that you can't be too definitive about 14 days or anything like that. I could give you arguments why I think it should be much earlier than that, but that's getting us into another realm.
One last question.